Alrighty then, it's time for another jungle history video. This is perhaps one of my favorite type of subjects as it allows me to introduce something new to players who haven't been around as long as I have. There have been some really shitty trends in the jungle in past seasons that would make your current gripe seem minimal in comparison. Looking back at past seasons and mistakes allows you to understand why Riot ended up making certain changes to the game at some point, and why they go to great lengths to avoid returning to any of these old standards. The jungle has no doubt been the role that has wildly shifted the most throughout the history of the game. The flow, the dynamics, the cast, and expectations have constantly changed, and it's gone through phases where Riot has tried to weaken it, promote it, or just outright kill it. Anyhow, we're starting off with one of the worst jungle trends in history, the level 2 roam. I struggle to call this actually jungling, but it basically consisted of a champion with Smite obtaining level 2 and going on a ganking spree immediately. This can still be done to this day, but it was way worse back then. See, in the earliest of seasons, the jungle monster camp spawned so early that you could reasonably take one down and reach level 2 before lane minions had even reached the lane. A level 2 jungler could be waiting in a bush nearby just to murder you the second you got too close. It was a terrible trend since you really weren't playing the damn game for the most part. It was just waiting around until somebody fucked up. You barely farmed and you walked around aimlessly. It was dull because the game was more about going through the motions than anything else. It's important to mention this trend first because it spun into one of the most reviled eras of jungling ever. The naked jungler, as some would call it, was a trend in which junglers would only obtain boots, wards, and a gold generating item. Junglers were essentially a glorified secondary support who would occasionally gank, but most likely would just focus on obtaining map control with an Oracle's Elixir, which was an item that could spot wards as long as you had the buff. There were times where some players playing a super support jungler like Nunu could purchase Oracle's Elixir and not lose the item until the end of the game simply because there was no actual fighting occurring for the first 20 minutes of the game. Games were notoriously long during this era, and the naked jungler trend is a big reason for this. The jungler was also not entitled to their own jungle after a certain point. After the first clear, the laners would start poaching the monsters and the jungler would have to make do with just gold items. This trend is also why some players still insist on calling certain junglers like Jarvan and Nautilus support junglers, because they were only CC bots who would likely die after their first rotation. It was boring and slow, and thankfully Riot has been periodically making changes to avoid ever returning to something like this. If you hate lane swapping and how the early game of a lot of competitive matches is just taking down towers, the alternative is to return to this stalemate kind of gameplay, which I assure you is far more boring. Now this trend carried a bit more personal weight, but it was definitely a pretty stupid problem for a while. The revival of the farming jungler when Feral Flare, and then later Sated Devour, was released introduced players to a method of jungling that hadn't existed since Season 0 and the start of Season 2. It became a trend where there were plenty of players convinced that it was the holy grail of items and would spam the item on everyone they could and would try to farm it up over doing anything else. While the item wasn't bad on a good cast of champions, it definitely didn't need to be built on champions like Nautilus or Amumu. There were several Reddit threads complaining about junglers who wouldn't gank and who wouldn't participate in any team objectives. They would farm the item as fast as they could and then come out when they were ready, despite the fact that the game was probably already over. Players would do it on champions not capable of taking advantage of the item, and it was frustrating for other players. Riot took steps to ease this in the future by allowing Feral Flare's replacement, Sated Devour, to gain stacks by actually participating in things and rewarding the player for being one to slay objective monsters. Either way, this trend, as was already sated, simply frustrated everyone. You'd have a jungler who wouldn't assist your team, but if they were on the opposing team, you'd basically be on a clock and punished if your team wasn't smart enough to pressure their opponents or if the team dragged the game out too long. Alright, this next trend has a chance of repeating the most, and it often does. Thankfully, Riot keeps trying to avoid it happening, but unfortunately it's not something that can be fully squelched. The Unholy Trinity of the jungle. This is the often occurring trend in which only 3, and sometimes 4, junglers are the only ones considered even worth picking. While some would put the first Unholy Trinity being Lee Sin, Vi, and Jarvan, the trend actually started all the way back since beta. Back in Season 0, you had a Trinity that would shift every other patch, usually because a new champion was introduced every 2 weeks and shook things up. In fact, I can't even pinpoint the first exact Trinity. The earliest I can remember was things like Trundle, Uri, and Warwick during a bruiser/fighter jungle meta, and then later shifting into a ganking Trinity of Lee Sin, Warwick, and Nocturne. And then still it kept shifting. Season 2 had several Trinities such as the Dr. Mundo, Shyvana, and Udyr Trinity to the boring as hell Nunu, Nautilus, and Maokai one. Remember, this doesn't mean you had to play these champions, it just means that these were the ones you were most expected to play, and the ones you most expect to see in competitive. It became very repetitious, and you'd get bashed for not picking any of them if they were available, and oftentimes you'd be made to regret it when your opponent runs a train on your ass. Also remember that this is a reoccurring trend, and it could happen again, but at least Riot is trying to embrace counter champions and flavorful champions to encourage different picks rather than the same ones over and over. Now for the worst goddamn trend of all time that has thankfully dissipated into a trickle of nothing. Smiteless jungling. Oh, you'd think this was a minor thing, especially if you've been playing only recently, but it wasn't. There were a lot of advocates for jungling without Smite to the point where I was constantly harassed in some of my videos for telling players to take it. There were constant debates on the forums about it despite the fact that even pros were vehemently telling players that Smite was important. However, at the same time, some writers were telling players that Smite was purely optional and they wanted the spell to be removed altogether. This became exacerbated during Season 2 when Riot made the jungle weaker and insinuated that it did so you wouldn't have to rely on Smite in any way. It didn't help that in Season 0, some of the best junglers were super sustained to the point that they did not need Smite to help them jungle, so some players saw it redundant. Counter jungling wasn't also widespread, so they didn't get punished for it either. You'd think something like this ended after Season 2, but it didn't. Season 3 still had this since buff to buff clearing was the norm, and not the most difficult for most junglers. The last holdouts for this were the Shaco players who insisted he didn't need Smite at all. This shit lasted until Riot made Smite mandatory by locking the items behind it, and now with junglers not being able to reach level 2, it's pretty much gone and dead. Obviously, you know why this was such a stupid trend and a big issue. Teams with these players would end up having to put Smite on someone else, usually the support, since they needed objective control. You'd have to protect your own jungler from invasions, and you'd be doomed if they failed their first gank with the double summoner spells. Again, thankfully this died out, but in my opinion, it was definitely the worst trend to ever plague the jungle. This channel is supported by my sponsors, Crunchyroll and Loot Crate. Check out the description below for links to the websites. Signing up for any trials, including Crunchyroll's free anime trial, greatly supports my channel. Also remember to give the video a like to support the channel and subscribe if you haven't yet.